Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Taylor and Francis, we will be discussing data sharing trends and opportunities in the humanities and social sciences. When we think about research data sharing, we often default to the STEM disciplines. Frankly, so do the humanists to a degree. But that's why we're here, because there are actually many opportunities for the HSS disciplines to cross-pollinate with data sharing techniques. Funders, as they do for the sciences, are encouraging HSS researchers to share data, and publishers like Taylor and Francis are exploring ways to develop policies around data sharing practices as well. And libraries, with the research data services they provide for the sciences, are already well positioned to support these workflows for the humanities. Joining me to discuss this in a 4-episode series are Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor and Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor and Francis. In this first episode, we look at the current state of data sharing in the humanities and social sciences, define some of what can be considered data in these fields, and then speculate a bit about what the Nelson Memo's impact on the practice might look like going forward. Okay, Emily and Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Hi, Bill. Lovely to be here.
Hello.
Hi, great to be here.
Awesome. So why don't we start with a lay of the land, so to speak. Can you describe the current landscape for sharing data in the humanities and social sciences, and then maybe differentiate between open data in the humanities versus the social sciences?
Sure. I think what's maybe interesting about this space is how varied it is. So, especially in the humanities, you'll see some pockets of good practice where data sharing is maybe better established. So, archaeology would be an example of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then other disciplines in the humanities where there's just less activity overall. So, maybe history, philosophy, religion. I think in contrast, social sciences has been better established in this space, particularly in the quantitative social sciences. So there are really long-standing infrastructures for data sharing in social sciences. So in the US, the ICPSR was founded in the 60s and the UKDA in the UK as well. So I think there's more of a kind of historical context for data sharing in social sciences, although still challenges around human data. So thinking about the landscape, I don't think it's helpful to look at it as humanities and social sciences in one bucket, or even just humanities on its own as one set of practices.
So it's a bit more kind of research community based, perhaps, that it's that you find it in particular pockets of researchers, and not even sort of perhaps not even at the disciplinary level, but the sort of subdisciplinary level. I think sort of qualitative social sciences like the humanities or humanities subjects have also had a slightly larger challenge with it. There's less uptake, or researchers themselves don't entirely know where to start.
So community level, you mean, Emily, that people are being proactive about it and just kind of reaching out on their own, or is it a little bit more organized than that?
I think that you can find it sort of perhaps more in pockets around certain topic areas,
Okay.
where perhaps in more applied qualitative areas where there's a particular public problem to solve, or researchers just have a network where they're coming together around these sorts of problems, I feel like you start to see a bit more of the uptake happening. I don't know if, Rebecca, you would say that that's what you're seeing too.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors that lead to certain communities or certain disciplines doing things differently. Like I gave the example of archaeology as a humanities discipline that is maybe a bit further advanced. And as I understand, the reasons for that are around the way that archaeological research is sometimes commissioned. So it can be connected to kind of building or infrastructure projects, and there's an expectation that there's a kind of connection with the public good or open sharing of government data that's led to that kind of data being shared. And then I think we're going to talk a lot more about identifying data. So like the quantitative data sets, it's just easier to understand that that is data. And there's disciplines that are working in more qualitative space where that just isn't the case. And even working with physical objects as what we might call their inputs to the research. So like you can see how these areas, like some have better practice, some have done not so much, and it's really clear why. But it's also interesting to think, well, how do we move everyone a bit further forward given the varied nature of what they're working with?
I think that's an important point, just that it's often sort of a combination of factors, including that, as you say, the funding landscape and the way that that directs researchers, the ways that they work with each other, how that connects to what sorts of common good a certain research community is seeing, as well as the mandates or policies they're operating under, whether that's the institution or governmental level. And that I think can lead to those outcomes depending on how those pressures come together for a certain discipline or subdiscipline.
Mm-hmm. So on the more qualitative side of things, where the disciplines are in the data is more qualitative. I mean, no one's trying to shoehorn them into like you must find data or you must interpret this as data somehow. It's like correct or are they feeling pressure to sort of at all to find opportunities for data sharing among themselves?
I think there's a lot of nuance there. So I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as pressure, but equally, where there are these emerging policies, for example, from funders or journals,
Right.
they do tend to be drafted maybe with the life sciences or STEM in mind. So like it's not that there's kind of pressure for humanities and social scientists in the qualitative space to look for data and find it. It's that I think there's maybe a perception that there's policy being forced on them that's not appropriate, and in that way they're confused as to what they're being asked to do.
Okay.
Just thinking about the why, and sort of, is this because researchers are being shoehorned into something that doesn't fit them, as in is this sort of a STEM focus that is being laid on top of disciplines that don't actually fit this appropriately, or is it coming from other directions? I do think that there has been an increase in, for humanities disciplines, the need to try to show more clearly why humanities matter. And I think that as we're seeing humanities programs under pressure and a lot of them being shut down, so we're seeing that not just in the US, but globally, where foreign language programs are being shut down. We've just seen that in Australia with a couple of universities under pressure. Macquarie University and the University of Wollongong are facing these issues. We're seeing defunding of humanities programs. That's happened in some European countries recently, and that the sort of response to that is to realize that while people see the utility of sciences and hard sciences, they don't always immediately see the benefit and the impact of humanities and qualitative social science disciplines. And to some degree, this sort of increasing impact and increasing the ability to talk about why these disciplines matter does connect back to, well, how do we share the kind of core parts of research across the cycle? And that's not just about a research article that's just directed to a sort of an academic audience, but also beyond that in sort of the increase in publicly engaged humanities, which we work with quite a bit on our editorial side, or also, another applied disciplines. My background is applied linguistics and sociolinguistics, and researchers in these disciplines are often doing in-classroom research with teachers, looking at second language environments, and are often facing the challenge of knowing that their research is important for people in their real lives, but not always knowing how to take that academic work out into the real world. And I think, broadening how we think about how we share more parts of research can also feed into how we make sure that the wider public knows why these disciplines matter for humanity, if that's not getting too
Right.
earnest about it.
Yeah, no, that matters. Um, so let's talk about data itself. Can you sort of help us understand what can be categorized as data in HSS? But it seems like the social sciences, as we've discussed, may already have a leg up here.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways that you can think about this. And if you're looking at kind of the policy space and how this has been defined, you'll see like a couple of ways that this can be done. So something that we do in our journals instructions for authors is kind of think about the breadth of what this data can look like and be quite not prescriptive but descriptive, so trying to ensure that any author who encounters this guidance will see something that resonates with them. So we
Mhm.
literally will give a list of your data might be archival documents, it could be a museum object, audio files, AV material, images, transcripts, field notes, surveys, and trying to be really all encompassing so that a researcher will see this and think, yes, that is what I used as part of my research method, and I understand now what you meant. And then the second way you can think about it, and I think I actually prefer this, is thinking about defining it as the input or output of your research without which you couldn't have drawn your conclusions. So what would a reader need to see to understand what you had done and how you got to your conclusion at the end? And I also came across a definition that I really like from Daria, which is the digital research infrastructure for arts and humanities in the EU. And they talk about data in the humanities as being born or qualified as data in the course of the research process. So being kind of selected and integrated into a research project is what makes it data. And I think with those two ways of thinking about it, you can really encapsulate like this is what we're talking about when we ask you as a publisher to share the data.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I like that second definition. That's really helpful. So, at Taylor and Francis, how else are you helping authors and researchers identify, the parts of their scholarship that could be data sets?
There's a couple of ways, and I think we focused to date really on the explicit guidance. So I think what we found looking around at what other publishers have done and what journals are doing in humanities and social sciences is there wasn't a lot of that specificity. So you can look at a journal's instructions for authors and you'll see the same guidance that you'd find on a journal in life sciences. Like there was nothing to differentiate. So we decided the first thing that we needed to do was just be really clear about what we're asking for. So all of that kind of guidance around what type of resource we're thinking about or how you might come to conclusions about what your data consists of, we wanted to put that on our journal landing pages so people could find it and understand. I think behind the scenes, it's also quite important that our editorial teams like have that same understanding, because like myself and Emily might have definitions of data in humanities and social sciences and feel like we have a good understanding, but we're not the people who are speaking to authors. So
Mhm.
I think it's really important that editorial have that same understanding. And then finally, I think something that researchers talk quite a lot about as a gap is training. And we do provide free webinars. So we've done some on specifically humanities and social science data sharing. They're free for researchers to attend. I don't know how much of an impact they have because you'll always be speaking to a somewhat small group of individuals. And I think the kind of grounding in written guidance and resources is where we've put our focus initially.
Okay, great. So I want to go back a couple years to the OSTP Nelson memo back in 2022, and that was, very STEM focused. But I'm wondering, there is an HSS component to that. I'm wondering if you could talk about in the last couple of years, what you've seen come out of that,
Mm.
if anything.
I think what was immediately clear about what was different about Nelson versus Holdren, the 2013 guidance, was that it was going to impact, that Nelson was going to impact humanities and social
Mm.
sciences because of the change from the large agencies that were covered in the original memo. So it was, I think it's above $100 million in funding were affected by the first memo, and that for Nelson it was everybody, and so it meant that you have agencies like NASA, the NSF, NIH, who are all very well established in these sorts of policies. I think the NIH data sharing policy came in at the beginning of 2023. Is that right? So they had sort of already planned to propel forward the data sharing expectations of their grantees. I think for agencies like other ones that we work with, like IMLS, where they're dealing with the library community, and for NEH and other agencies, it's such a different sort of landscape that it is quite a different amount of assessment that's needed on what data sharing is, and that they're at a very different starting point for these practices.
Okay. So yeah, it's a little bit of an elephant in the room, and I understand this might be very speculative in terms of answering this part of the question, but with the change in administration here in America, anything top of mind that you would speak to in regards to open research and so on?
I mean, I guess the first thing to say is it's not entirely clear yet what will happen.
Yeah, right.
Under the first Trump administration, there was discussion of public access. So it's not necessarily clear that it will be entirely dismantled. At the same time, and I say this having been at the Charleston Library Conference recently and hearing discussion there, and attending a panel where some societies and librarians were talking about what they're expecting to see. So it's speculation, but beyond just my speculation, I suppose, that we are likely to see agency cuts, and that will have a knock-on effect in terms of what the funding for open access, for public access, will look like. So what the shape of the memo itself will take, it's unclear, but I think that there's an expectation that the budget cuts that will be coming will have an effect on what's possible for public access.
You just heard from Dr. Rebecca Taylor Grant, Head of Open Data Initiatives at Taylor & Francis, and Dr. Emily Farrell, Global Commercial Director, Open Research, also at Taylor & Francis. Join us next week when we look more closely at the opportunities for data sharing in the HSS fields, as well as some of the challenges. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Taylor & Francis. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.